kick off, or do you want to kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, James is going to give us a brief intro.
Sure.
Guys, I've got a list of questions here that people have sent in previously, and obviously we can work away with them throughout the session, but I think it'll be really interesting to have this as a more interactive Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any stage. We'll focus on them, but I also have a list of questions here that we've been sent so we can work out the best way. So James, I'm really looking forward to this.
We can unmute people as well if they want to ask questions verbally. Yeah, okay. So honestly, Lee, I wasn't nervous about this at all until about half an hour ago when I finally realized I was going to have to actually talk about all this stuff. Like, other than the individual chats I've had with various people around this area. So thanks for the introductions and thanks for inviting me to come talk about some interesting experiences over the last year. Something which is our colleagues in psychology have gone through for the past decade or so, and it seems as though we're well overdue for our reckoning of sorts in this field, and seem to have been somewhat at the front of the charge into that, or at least accompanying the people who might be at fault. So for those who aren't familiar, I guess I'll just give a very sort of quick rundown of some key events over the past year. But then I really want to, I said to Vanessa and Amir and Rosemary about I wanted this to be an interactive Q&A session. Like, at first it was like, could I deliver a talk? And I thought, well, it's not really the topic that lends itself well to a kind of lecture seminary kind of thing. It's better to just kind of talk about these things, I think. And of course, I'm lazy, so it saves me loads of time in terms of preparing slides and whatnot anyway. So some of the key events that most of you will be aware of, but for those who aren't, round about February last year, I was contacted by friend and colleague Andrew Vygotsky, asking with some queries around some data from some papers that I was a co-author on, led by Matthias Barballo, and with Paolo Gentile as the senior author. And he had some queries around some things that looked a little bit odd in the data, relating to one study specifically. But then as we got talking, it turned out that there were some oddities across a variety of studies. And so we, myself, Andrew, who was already looking at some of these issues with other colleagues, Greg Knuckles, Brad Schoenfeld, James Krieger, James Heathers, who most of you will be familiar with the name, were already looking into some of these issues. And then I got involved to give access to some of the data sets that I already had access to and try and mediate some discussion between us and Paolo and Matthias. And then, how can I put this politely? The shit hit the fan, and everything got all messy and human, as it normally does. And so we had to sort of bide our time, and there were various legal threats and backs and forths with journal editors. And eventually we decided that we would make formal retraction requests for these papers and publicize the findings that we had made around the data sets. So that happened about July last year. In that period, from sort of February to July, one paper was retracted because a research assistant owned up to fabricating some of the data in the study. We're still subsequently in the process of finding out what the journal's decisions are going to be regards the other papers that we've requested retractions on. I should say at this point, myself, my co-author James Fisher, who's also on these papers, and at least one other paper, our co-author Jürgen Giesing, are all in agreement that the papers should be retracted. None of the other authors are in agreement with us on that. So that's still ongoing. And then a separate issue, albeit related to the same research group with ex-colleague Paolo Gentile, was with regards to a meta-analysis that was published in BJSM. And that was, there were some interesting experiences around that in the preceding year, because BJSM got themselves quite heavily involved in the publicizing this meta-analysis. And misrepresenting the findings, albeit the findings that turned out to not be quite the findings because there were various errors in the actual analysis itself, which I take responsibility somewhat for overlooking during the process of that project, or not identifying myself. And so, yeah, so that paper has gone through a long process where another group led by Matt Howlands identified some of these issues. There was an expression of concern. And then finally, again, these things take a long time. It took Karim, BGSM's editor-in-chief, just over a year to make a decision as to what to actually do with that paper, and to finally retract it. So yeah, so it's been wonderful it's actually been quite nice to be able to remove those papers from my CV, and take them off my ResearchGate and post on various things that they've been retracted and try and warn people about the issues with them. And it's been an interesting experience over the last year. All of the various things I've learned with respect to kind of identifying some of these issues and I guess experiences. I won't necessarily say that, we've done the best job of handling some of the softer, intrapersonal aspects of these situations, but for what it's worth, I guess I can, tell you about my experiences if people want to know about them. So hopefully that's at least somewhat of a succinct or not background to what's gone on over the last year. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions on anything, and if I can answer them, I'll answer them. One thing I will say is I've got to be somewhat careful about exactly what I say, because of the legal threats that we've had around certain aspects of these situations. So if I can't say certain things, it'll be obvious that I can't say them.
Thanks so much, James. I think this is such an important topic for us all to talk about, because it's not the easiest one to talk about, but if we don't talk about it, I think we can't come to any kind of resolutions or move forward. So just thanks a million for being open enough to have this. As I mentioned, everyone please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask your questions or to put them in the chat. One that did come in is, how rife or common do you believe these issues are in our field, in kind of specifically sport and exercise science? And do you have any kind of red flags that you would advise reviewers, readers, or indeed co-authors to look out for in the work they're working on?
So I guess the first part of that, how rife do I believe inaccurate results in our field? Incredibly rife. How rife do I believe fraudulent results are in our field? I would say, no, that's maybe less rife. But yeah, I think, people wouldn't be involved in this seminar and STORK in general if they didn't have some belief that there were issues plaguing our field and that they need to be addressed to try and increase the accuracy somewhat of the claims and the results that we're presenting. I honestly don't think that outright fraud is as, I don't think it's particularly prevalent. I think it's a very slim proportion of the overall results out there and the overall body of the literature, and it seems to, well, albeit subject to some sort of sampling bias, they're at least more the actual cases of fraud seem to occur frequently from the same individuals. So I think it is a small number of individuals that are probably involved in these things. I think more generally, though, we should probably reflect as a community on, what is actually driving people to make those decisions. What are the kind of pressures in place that make people think, well, it's a better idea to risk potentially getting caught for fraud than, putting in the hard work to actually collect data ourselves. In terms of red flags, that's an interesting one because I think it's incredibly contextual. So having obviously seen what, at least in terms of sort of resistance training trials and the types of data that are captured in those kinds of trials relating to strength and, ultrasound measures of muscle thickness and, what we would expect that data to look like given the data generating processes of the study designs. You do start to sort of pick out things that just look a bit off. And at least in those examples, mostly that was in relation to the ridiculously tight variances around the data and how unlikely they actually were, given, if we were to actually sample them from a real population the way that they said that they were sampled. But I think what I tend to do now is, for starters, I don't review papers unless the data, materials, and code are openly available, or there's an incredibly good reason why not. So I've signed up to the peer review openness initiative, and anytime I get a review request in now that I'm willing to accept, I'll go straight back to the editors and say, look, I'll review this, but I'm only reviewing it if you make these things available. And actually, without fail, so far, every editor has come back and said, yeah, sure, okay, I'll go back to the authors and ask. And in one situation, the paper got withdrawn before that actually happened. So I don't know if that's because I asked, but most of the time, if you ask, people seem to be, at least in my experience, willing to share those things. And then what I find myself doing is you'd be surprised at how much you can kind of pick up just by eye looking across a data set, particularly the sort of data sets we typically work with, which aren't huge more often than not. And sort of odd patterns can start to jump out at you, which then prompt you to look a little bit deeper and think about what tools in the statistical repertoire might be able to help you probe this a little bit further and see how realistic some of the data actually is. But I think, yeah, red flags do somewhat require an intimate understanding of what the data is to begin with. It's not as simple as kind of saying, follow these guidelines for looking at it. You'll know what what VO2 data should look like from a CPET or whatever. There's some element of substantive knowledge that's needed around there as well. But I think really just making sure that the data is available for you to be able to spot those things in the first place is key.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Oh my gosh, there's like 17 things there I want to jump in and ask you more about. Question from John here. How have you changed your workflow to better catch such issues in the future? And have you any advice that you would offer to others who are in a similar position?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is the annoying thing, because I did do this during the time that I was collaborating with Paolo and Mateus Barmello on these studies. I was the annoying middle author who always asked for the data to be sent over and always wanted to rerun the stats and check that everything had been done okay. And during that period, I realized I was pissing people off and causing them more work than they really wanted. And every time I sent an email, I could just picture exactly how that was being received. Like, God, it's James again asking for the data and wanting to check things, and can't you just trust us that we're doing it right? And I think that's partly why, for example, in the meta-analysis issue that was retracted, I was incredibly busy and had the perspective that I was probably just pissing people off by asking for this stuff, and maybe I should just rely on people to get it right in the first place, which then came around to bite me in the ass because it turned out they hadn't, and I probably should have asked. But I mean, one of the key things for me that I've changed is that I just absolutely won't work on projects that I've not had the opportunity to check over, all aspects of it myself. Because from my perspective, and if under the kind of ICMJ guidelines, as an author on a paper, you should really be able to be responsible for all aspects of that paper. And so I'm not comfortable being an author on something that I can't turn around and say, like, yes, I'm happy that all aspects of this are accurate and that I've actually had the opportunity and have actually checked those things. And for me, it kind of works quite well because more often than not, I'm the guy in the groups that I collaborate with who's doing the data analysis and stuff anyway. And one thing I do try to do, though, is make sure that the work I do is easy to follow and well annotated so that any of my colleagues can do that as well. They normally don't want to, as much as I encourage them to check code and check data and stuff. They're more than happy to trust me, which is kind of weird and ironic. And I'm not sure I like them trusting me so much because I'm sure I get plenty of stuff wrong. But yeah, I think the biggest change for me has been that, and trying to normalize that. And at the moment, everyone who I work with knows that's what I'm about, and is happy to accommodate that. You know, they go into into that kind of collaboration knowing that James is going to have all these things that he wants from us, so we better make sure we've got them ready to pass over to him. And I encourage, you know, my PhD students in particular, encourage them to, you know, to work in a similar sort of way, to say, look, you know, you'll get given opportunities potentially to collaborate with people down the line, and learn from my mistakes that you need to make sure you are happy with, you know, the quality of work that you're putting your name to.
I'm getting that slightly uncomfortable feeling where I remember now the number of times that I've just blatantly scribbled my name saying I accept all responsibility on a paper when I haven't really done it at all. But I suppose just need to normalize that moving forward.
Yeah.
Denver Brown has a question here. With regards to your request for data code in order to review, how do you circumvent the issue of some data being restricted to use, for example, government population surveys, and unable to be shared? I suppose one answer that is rather new is synthetic data sets, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I mean, that's exactly what, as that I was reading that down thinking synthetic data, perfect. Yeah, I mean, with the peer review openness initiative anyway, as part of that, you know, you agree to allow authors to give a justified reason as to why they can't share that data. You know, it may be sensitive, there may be GDPR regulations that prevent them from being able to share certain data that's been used for it. But my recommendation has been, I've not had to recommend that, but I've been kind of ready to go like, here's a great paper on synthetic data sets, and there's some great packages that can help you, you know, produce data sets with the same characteristics as your data set has, so that I can kind of check that and look over it, and others can use that data set as well. We've been actually exploring it a little bit. We've not used it yet, but potentially producing some synthetic data sets, partly because I want to become a bit more familiar with doing that myself anyway, for some of our undergrad students to play around with in some of the units that they require data for, and currently we can't collect any data for them.
I think the next question here from Charles is on a similar theme. How have you found the practical accessibility of code and data beyond simply getting access to it? Have you found analyses code easy to run, reproduce yourself? What obstacles have you encountered? Is it quite easy to read, or have you had any issues with that?
That's a great question, and I'm a glutton for punishment because first of all, I'll admit that as much as my code is easily annotated for me, and I hope for other people, I'm not confident it's as good as it can be. It's probably not as good as yours, Charles. Definitely not. But I don't know. I quite like figuring it out. I like the fact that the code's there, even if I also find it interesting to see other people's code, to see how they do things, and try and understand that. So yeah, there are sometimes it would be nice to just be able to pick it up, look at it, and go like, oh, I know exactly what this is doing, and just, you know, run it and go, yep, it does exactly what I thought it would. That's wonderful. But it's also somewhat nice to kind of just get stuck into it and think like, wait, what's this bit doing? And, you know, is that quite kind of meeting the assumptions I think it's going to? Oh yeah, no, it does that. Okay, right. And then yeah, and working through it and kind of trying to also, in some way, I think it helps you get into the head of the authors a little bit and try and understand what their thought process was as you follow through their code. So I go either way in that respect. Like easy is nice, but also I don't mind working through it a little bit, as long as it's not just completely uninterpretable and utterly unannotated, where I have to keep going and looking up functions and in packages that I've never heard of. And
I'm once again getting that slightly uncomfortable feeling thinking about my own spreadsheets and data sheets of
that nervousness of like sharing code and going like, oh my God. But now I have the perspective of like, I'm going to share this. There's probably things that could be done way more efficiently. And my hope is someone will point out like, God, James, you're so stupid. Why'd you do it like that? You can do it like this. I'm like, awesome, thanks.
I suppose, again, as we normalize all of these practices more and more, we'll all learn from each other the best way to set things up when we kind of look at each other's. Just to check in with people, are you happy enough for me to continue just reading out the questions? Obviously, if people prefer to unmute themselves and ask the questions themselves, that's also fine, but I'm also happy to keep reading. Just feel free to let me know. Cool, thank you. Okay, next question from Chris, interesting one. How much do you think this relates to the call last year for all sports science papers to include at least one statistician as an author as standard? Could the statistician author's main role be to check for irregularities in the data as much as this is possible?
Yeah, so I think we're in a kind of situation in our field where that would be an ideal if everyone could do that. And honestly, I'd love to be able to do that, because I hate the idea of anyone thinking that I'm the quote unquote statistician on any of the papers that I'm involved in, because that feels like imposter syndrome to the extreme. But, you know, the reality is we don't have that luxury. And so this is where I think that, actually, I don't really know how I feel about this. It's one of those things where I kind of lean more towards the idea that, well, actually, let me put it this way. So if a journal has a requirement, it decides that they want to have a requirement that, you know, you have to have a statistician co-author on the paper. Probably a more efficient way of doing that would be for the journal to have a statistical editor themselves, which some do, rather than saying to every author that submits there they have to have a statistical co-author. But, you know, let's ignore that for the moment. Let's say they turned around and said that. You know, there's no obligation for journals to publish our papers. Okay, again, ignore all the how they're financed and blah 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 and all that kind of stuff. Let's pretend it's a journal that's not being funded through ridiculous profit margins from some pyramid scheme of scientific publishing that we all currently coexist in. But, you know, you could choose to, as an author, a researcher, or an author on a paper, to even have seek out a statistical co-author or not, and it would just limit where you can then communicate those results, if those are the choices that those wanting to give you a platform to communicate those results put on you. And so I kind of feel like, you know, if journals wanted to do that, they could do that, and that's fine. That's their choice. But I think probably a better approach, or one that I prefer, is just the idea of, you know, if things are more open and transparent so that people can post publication or post communication check these things, then, I mean, I'm all in favor of us completely binning journals in the first place. Like he says, as, you know, one of the co-managing editors for our two journals. But, you know, I'd love to just see living documents for all of this stuff. You know, if someone spots a mistake in your analysis, your code, whatever, you know, they contact you and say, hey, by the way, you know, there's this issue, and you go, oh, awesome, thanks. I'll quickly change that and I'll update it, whack a new PDF up there, you know, update all the code, version control it, and everyone can see exactly the journey that document has taken. You know, that would be the ideal. I appreciate that's going to be a long way off probably, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I've even answered the question now. I've kind of forgotten what the question was. So should you have a statistician? Probably. Can you have a statistician? Not always.
And I think I'm not sure if you're keeping up with the chat here. The messages are coming in quick and fast, but both Aaron and Andrew, who are co-authors on that paper, just put in a clarification there. The paper didn't specifically say all papers must include statisticians. It was more advocating for more statistical education so that everyone was better able to handle these analyses, and also seeking collaboration when needed. So I think, of course, there's going to be some nuance there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I didn't mean to imply that was what they were saying. You know, it was it's more like, it would be nice if everyone could think about this a bit more.
There's some interesting chats here going on about this topic, but I think another question that's come up. Hold on, sorry, give me a sec. I'm posting it in. Oh, sorry. From Sam Orange, could you give more detail on why the British Journal of Sports Medicine paper was retracted? The reasons are pretty vague. Thank you.
Yeah, so the main issues around that were some issues with some of the studies that were included, some issues around the way some of the effect sizes were calculated and some of the data that was extracted from those studies in general. And so these points were first noted. And, you know, if anyone's read the Retraction Watch article on this, when I was first invited to be involved in that project, I initially wanted to say, send everything over, I'll rerun it, double check it, etc., etc. And was, as we all are, incredibly busy and decided, no, do you know what? Like they can handle this. That's fine. I'll provide the you know, feedback on various aspects of the document that I need to, but I'm going to trust they get it right. And then obviously some issues were noted where some things didn't quite look right and didn't jive with a more recent, well, not more recent, but a meta-analysis that had preceded it recently. And so Matt Hollins and some collaborators went and pulled out some of the studies, checked some of the exclusion criteria that didn't quite match up, some data extraction that didn't quite match up, recalculated some effect sizes that didn't quite match up. And it was enough to kind of pose, well, there might be other issues in it as well. Now, I'll caveat that I still haven't had the time nor the inclination to go back and look at it, but have had some conversations about potentially just redoing the whole bloody thing at some point this year, which has been on my cards, but really just been waiting for someone to give me a kick up the arse to do it. So yeah, it was mainly, there was nothing, unlike the some of the issues around the Barbello stuff, this was more errors than anything else. That in response, my co-authors were unable to adequately satisfy the concerns of those who had raised them. And so the decision was that the journal would retract it. At first I was somewhat relieved because I was like, oh, thank God, like that's been plaguing me, because I've been thinking I just need to get that redone, like get it off my desk. And then when they retracted it, I was like, oh, phew, thanks. I can focus on the projects I actually care about, because, you know, who cares about high intensity interval training and fat loss anymore?
I think we've really interesting question from Aaron here, but before, James, I'm not sure if you're following all of the chats, just like to highlight a couple of messages that come in there from Kieran and Jenny, just basically saying thanks, how refreshing it is not only to see these things happening, but also to be able to chat about it in a forum, and many people in the chat are echoing that message from Kieran, so just to highlight that. Next question. James, at the beginning, you mentioned that you believe inaccuracies are rife, but not necessarily fraud. Do you believe these inaccuracies are based on misinterpretations and miscalculations of the data, or do you believe it is driven by some level of dishonesty, i.e. cherry picking? Interesting one, juicy one.
I think it's probably some element of both. I think it's also some element of wishful thinking from many people who can't quite let go of pet hypotheses and theories, and can't quite acknowledge, because let's be honest, data is hard. The research we do is hard to do with real people, and getting them to do interventions and all sorts of stuff, and it's made even harder at the moment. I think some people don't want to come to terms with how limited some of the data that we have and some of the studies that we have and some of the study designs that we utilize are, and want to overextend the conclusions that they can make from them. And I'm not even sure, I don't know whether it's even, I don't think it's conscious. Like, I think there's almost a kind of subconscious kind of need to be seen as relevant. And that's the sort of feeling I get when looking across our field a lot. And as you can probably all tell, I'm just a bit of a kind of cynic, and, you know, as long as I keep smiling and laughing and can kind of, you know, distract myself by playing VR or whatever every now and then, and spending time with family and friends, you know, I'm happy to keep plugging away at this stuff and doing stuff that's interesting. But I think we've got a long way to go really before we're producing work that is robust enough for some of the sorts of claims and conclusions that I see across our field. And I feel like that's maybe a bigger issue than some of the kind of, well, did you use the right statistical model here? Or, yeah, I feel like we need more of a kind of, we need to look hard in the mirror and think about, like, what the hell are we actually doing? Like, what's the whole goal of this endeavor?
I think that's such a big thing, is that it's how we define success. Like, if our study works, we've succeeded. Yeah. Whereas, well, really the answer shouldn't really be any of our business if we set up the right question. I think a question that we had prior to the thing, and that maybe follows on from what you're saying there, is, do you believe that the current reward structure in academia can inadvertently promote bad practices? It can sometimes feel like the perceived rewards of poor practices, like increased publications leading to greater grant success, maybe greater commercialization of your research, more job opportunities, etc., may potentially outweigh the consequences, which I think are pretty low, to be honest. And this may be particularly relevant for students, postdocs, who are living kind of contract to contract. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different tack with this one as well, because so I'm someone who works both in academia and outside of academia. My posts at UK Active, they're a not-for-profit. And it's a very different world doing research in that environment compared to doing it in academia. No, they don't give a crap really about the papers I publish. They're more interested in findings that fit the narrative and the lobbying and stuff that they're doing, or whatever the commercial partners' interests are. So there are other kind of incentives and structures that kind of bias or work hard to bias, and you have to fight hard against to try and combat them in that sphere as well. I think we all probably agree here that the system's a bit shit and broken and could be a lot better if we burnt it all down and designed it from the ground up. But
anarchy.
But so I guess I'll look at this from the perspective of, like, what do I tell my students? When I take on new PhD students, like, right at the start, I make sure they're really clear that, the academic job market's shit. And it's really hard to get a postdoc. Like, I didn't do a postdoc. I never got a postdoc. I was just one of the lucky ones who happened to fall into a lecturing post straight after PhD, just because I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I'm forever grateful for that. But it's getting more and more competitive. And the more I've worked outside of academia, I've realized that there's so many other opportunities as well that I get them to sort of think, don't limit yourself to thinking you'll only feel like you've been successful if you get that academic post, or you get that postdoc, or you get whatever. Keep your options open, build a skill set that is transferable and doesn't just limit you to thinking, like, all I can do is work in academia now. So, like, at our university at the moment, we've just gone through a big round of redundancies, and speaking to a lot of colleagues who unfortunately we're going to be losing, they're all really scared, because all they've ever known is working in academia, and they know the market's terrible at the moment for various reasons, but they don't know what on earth they would do outside of academia. So for me, kind of having that experience of stepping outside has really opened my eyes to say, like, well, there are other games you can go out and play. You don't just have to play this academic game. And actually, if you play your cards right, you can kind of get enough chits that are transferable across industries, and open up your prospects a little bit more.
Fantastic advice, one that I'm taking to heart here. Chris, yes, I do agree with you a lot that it's a big issue across the board. It's not just restricted to publications and retractions. We have a couple of questions here that I think really lead from one to the other based on what you've been saying. John has asked, how have you found the response, both within your school, your university, and more broadly?
So I'll work out from broad back to school. So broadly, it's been brilliant. Like, I almost feel a little bit guilty that, if anything, it's probably given me a better reputation, at least in terms of the way I've handled things. So it's been, it's been wonderful. I've only had, other than the legal threats, of course, I've only had positive responses from people and encouragement, and just really, great support from everyone. At the university level, same sort of thing. But it's not really an important factor for them at the moment. They've got other more pressing issues at the moment, but both, I spoke to our Vice Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor about it, and because, was worried that there might be some concerns of reputation and things like that. But their perspective was, no, this is exactly the way you should handle the situation. So, kudos for that. And then at the school level, I don't think anyone really cares that much. Like, other than sort of close colleagues, they're like, oh, wait, did you have a paper retracted? Like, yeah. And then you sort of explain it to them. They go like, oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know that. Because, you realize that the people you work in too close proximity to, you don't actually really pay attention to what they're doing. And particularly now with remote working as well.
This is very true.
Yeah,
I think
pretty positive in general.
Similar question, but from a different perspective. Brian has asked that yourself and other co-authors, you mentioned James Fisher, have several papers in collaboration. You guys are keen for retraction, they're not. What's the argument for maintaining these? Where's that perspective coming from? Or can we, is that
I think, and Andrew and myself and the others have kind of talked about this a lot. It's hard to see exactly why they disagree with it, but I think it's a combination of some provincialism and loyalty to their other co-authors, and particularly those sort of based in the Brazilian universities where that kind of collaborative group has been working. Also, and this is one of the tough things about this, is in general, this is probably a group of people who have above average statistical literacy relative to the rest of our field. The rest of our field is not very good, as we all know. And some of the issues that we've identified they're not easy to just intuitively kind of get what the issues are and how we've identified them. And I think it's a combination of the sort of loyalty and also the just inability to understand that these are real problems with this data that need explaining. I think there's also an element of kind of camps, if that makes sense. So I mean, I laugh because I've been doing work on resistance training for the better part of a decade now, and I find it interesting and whatnot. But I'm, most of the research we've done, I'm not under any illusion that it's sort of changing the world. It's funny because most of the studies that were retracted were comparisons of single and multi-joint exercises on strength and hypertrophy, or comparisons of different set volumes across the week on strength and hypertrophy. And I sort of always had this perspective that, like, at worst, even if people are following the results of these studies, there might be people doing, a few fewer sets of barbell curls in the squat rack. And actually that might be a good thing for the world, really. But I think there's this, I know that some of those co-authors see it as a kind of us and them sort of, we've published these things that have contradicted some of the work of some of the group that were involved in identifying some of the issues in their papers. And so there's this kind of battling of camps, and they think it's just motivated reasoning, and people have been motivated to dig deep and look for the problems in that data and pick up on anything and try and turn it into something bigger than it is. I'm convinced that that's part of it, at least from the sort of interactions that I've had with various emails, the length of War and Peace going back and forth.
I think that really follows on from the kind of the comments you made earlier about kind of getting attached to an idea and maybe blowing the idea out of perspective, like it's not that big a deal if the results don't support your initial hypothesis. Nothing happens. The world won't stop. But I suppose if you do get quite attached, it might be tricky. Loads more really nice questions here. Just as a slight aside, Vanessa and Charles made some really interesting comments about we don't necessarily need to go the direct way or not the direct way, that's all the wrong way to phrase it, but that kind of postdocs versus tenured positions versus contracts. There's a lot of different ways we can approach that. And again, I personally love hearing that from other people, because it kind of sometimes get tunnel vision of the way to go. And Charles, I'd also just like to say, I love your cat crossing the screen there.
Speaking of unusual pathway, 20 years of music.
All right. So 20 years of music prior to going into, oh wow. Oh, we need a whole seminar to know about that. I'll continue with Jenny's question though for the moment. Jenny, what can we do as researchers to decrease misinterpretation, miscalculations of data, or improve our inferences? I do understand that a lot of sports scientists, including myself, and I'll also jump on that one, need to upskill in statistics, and there needs to be a change at undergraduate levels. But are there smaller steps we can do now to change our way, or what are your 3 top tips for kind of immediately moving forward?
Oh, I hate questions like this, just because it's hard to really narrow down to like, oh, what are the 3 top things you would do? Actually, he's going to hate me for saying this, but I'll tell you what my top tip is having a friend like Andrew Vygotsky to just bug with stats questions all the time. I've probably learned more just from Facebook Messenger chats with Andrew than I have from any of my own self-directed learning and stuff like that. So yeah, if there's basically find people who are way smarter than you to help you with these things and help you learn these things. That's definitely number 1. Yeah, I don't know, because it's tough. It's not an easy topic to get your head around. I guess I can only really say kind of what I've found useful. And part of it has just been sort of stubbornly just banging my head against stuff until it sort of sinks in. And then suddenly there's that light bulb moment. You go like, oh my God, that's what that meant. Like I suddenly understand it. And then all of a sudden, like, you're like, well, how did I not get that for so long? Particularly around statistics, I find a lot of concepts, as much as I don't really want to talk, lean on the idea of learning styles, but I find a lot of statistical concepts are easier to kind of almost think of in a kind of abstract visual way. I'm not very good at maths. It's taken me a long time to kind of get to the point where I even understand some of the notation for some of the modeling that practically I've just been doing for much longer. And I find that some of the excellent sort of visualizations that people have created now for a lot of these concepts really help me understand them. I think actually, one of the things that's helped me more is first starting off with understanding what the kind of data generating process is for any kind of study that we're doing in the first place. I think study design is probably a much more foundational thing that people need to really get their heads around first, to then move on to the next step of sort of trying to understand, well, what kind of statistical model kind of overlays onto that study design and data generating process that we've kind of set up or created, or always out there in the world if we're using kind of existing secondary data or whatever. So find someone smarter than you. Wait, what was the other one? Look at picture books and don't think about stats first.
That's a huge one. I'm by no means, very definitely not a statistician. Haven't a clue, trying to improve, but I'm lucky enough to work with a guy who's way smarter than me called Paul Swinton. But I think for me, the big thing is figuring out the questions that I can then bring to the stats person. Like, we can't just send them spreadsheets and say, find me something, fix something, check something. So I think figuring out the questions in your own words, I think is a huge thing, because then the statistician can actually get in there and figure it out.
Yeah.
So
I've just seen Aaron's message as well. And yeah, I get another thing that makes me feel confident is knowing that none of the statisticians agree on this stuff anyway. So, you know, I can't be expected to get any of it right.
My personal favorite is always if I ask what I think is, I'm just like, I just don't get what's going on here, and I send a message, and then the statistician I work with, a guy called Winston, comes back and like, oh, actually that's a really interesting question, we're going to have to look at that. And I was like, oh whoa, I didn't even realize it was a question, I just didn't get it.
So you come across like problems and you go like, what should I do here? It's like, oh yeah, I don't think that's something anyone's really given much thought to.
Yeah. I think following on directly from that is a really good point and question from Charles is, where is our field now with understanding uncertainty in statistical results? So she's just graduated from maths and stats, and even with 10 years of study, feels like she still doesn't understand applying stats. I suppose, how do the rest of us, how can we even start those who don't have degrees? Where do you think we are in terms of understanding the basics around uncertainty?
Oh, we don't have uncertainty in our field. You know, everything is conclusive. Or at least you get the impression from looking over things. Yeah, I think I think our field is behind most in that respect. You know, probably save a few people in here who are in this group and beyond who appreciate that more often than not what we're doing is kind of communicating we should be just communicating our uncertainty in the results that we've got, rather than trying to pick out the oh, look at the thing we found. I think we can improve that a lot, but I think it's tough because we, you know, so many of the people who, you know, I'm thinking editors, reviewers, even, you know, senior co-authors and collaborators and colleagues, they're a product of the, you know, environment and the training that they've had, and they operate on these kind of heuristics, and they don't think about, you know, some of these concepts. And so it's tough to, when you start to kind of get a slight appreciation for them, there's this process of trying to sort of like persuade them that no, you see all that stuff you've been doing for years, and it's not the best way of doing it. Maybe we should do it this way, or maybe we should tone down that a little bit more. We're not really that sure about it. People don't like that. So it takes a lot of work and effort to try and get that across in things. So I like to think that in the work that I lead on, I try and be as uncertain as possible about everything, because I don't really know a lot. And I'm not really convinced, other than some of the cool big data stuff I've been doing recently, just because, you know, when you've got like 15,000 people, who've all done the same thing, it's a little bit easier. But yeah, I think trying to express that is key. And it's just, it takes some degree of tenacity, I think, to and maybe a bit of humility as well, to realize, like, look, you know, don't get annoyed because people don't get this stuff. You know, it's not their fault. They're not willingly trying to misunderstand it, or, you know, they're a product of having been trained and brought up, you know, in that kind of tradition. And, you know, I would have been doing the same thing, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, if I hadn't have, you know, been exposed to these various new ideas and got interested and just, you know, jumped into the I like to think that there's not really a Dunning-Kruger curve. It's just a Dunning-Kruger pit, that just like a bottomless pit. Like, you jump in and just you know, the more you learn, the less and less confident you feel about anything at all. And, you know, just appreciate that. It's tough to make that initial leap, and you've got to kind of stand with them and hold their hand and say, come on, it's fine, jump in, there's no worries here.
I think that's such an important message to normalize. What's that quote, Maya Angelou? Do the best you can do until you know better. Then when you can do better, then when you know better, do better. And I think we have to remember that. None of us were born knowing this. I'm mortified by some of my previous papers, but, you know,
the benefit I think we've got is, by and large, you know, most of the work we do, you know, people's lives aren't dependent on it. Well, I mean, you know, it's not like if we get something wrong in our field that we're really going to cause too much damage. So be fine with making mistakes, learning from them, and improving on them in the future. You know, I mean, that should be normalized anyway, but, you know, we have somewhat of a luxury in our broad field that, like, no one really cares about us anyway. So, you know, we're kind of the novelty science, really. Like, no, we're all wonderful. All of our work is incredibly important, mine especially so. But
James, there was two questions that kind of came in previously that I think really follow on from things that you've just mentioned. I'll go with them in order. Number one, do you have any reflection and advice on navigating press releases in terms of impacts versus accuracy? I think that's particularly relevant also in the Twitter world, where how do we convey these uncertainties when people just want the bottom line? Do you have any thoughts on navigating that process?
Yeah. So, do you know what? This is worse outside of academia, where particularly working for an organization that somewhat has a lobbying role as well, and a very active public affairs, policy, and comms department. I love all the guys in those teams that I work with to bits, but they are frustrating to say the least to work with. No, you can't say that. Well, why not? This sounds a bit more catchy. Yeah, but the results don't actually support that statement. You know, it's, again, I think it comes a little bit back to what I was saying about being just that annoying person who just constantly asks, can I just check that? Can I just check that? Can you run that past me? You know, with respect to the code and data and you know, aspects of the manuscript. You, to some extent, need to be able to, as best as possible, be involved in the process of any kind of press release. You know, we with the meta-analysis that BGSN did, like they actively rewrote parts of the paper, including the title and the conclusions in the abstract. And, you know, they've, if anyone saw the guest blog post that I wrote for Yoni Friedhoff, trying to sort of combat the hype around the paper before I realized it was all errors anyway. It was an interesting process. And again, reflecting on that, I think I would have just stuck my oar in a bit more around it. I wasn't the senior or lead author on that paper. So again, at the time, I you know, with hindsight, I wish I had done so. Yeah, just getting as involved as possible, but also, I don't know, maybe people have come to expect this from me a little bit, with the people I work with, as being that kind of just pain in the ass. But you know, if a press release or something like that comes out around your own work that you look at and you think, yeah, they've kind of overhyped what we've done there, get on social media and correct it, or contact the journalist, or you know, whatever. Like when the BGSN paper got retracted, so Gretchen Reynolds for the New York Times wrote an article about that paper, and as soon as we knew that there were issues with it, I got in contact with her to let her know that, and as soon as it was retracted, told her, and within a day, they had put a statement on the article to say that the paper had been retracted. So, you know, and a year later, we're still waiting for journals to make decisions around our retraction requests. But, you know, so be prepared to kind of combat that stuff yourself if you need to. Don't be too worried about, you know, quelling your own hype.
Question from Chris here. Could there be an argument for our field to engage with bodies such as the Royal Statistical Society and American Statistical Society to improve the undergrad and postgrad stats and research design education standards? I know you're involved in the BASIS Stat Analytics Interest Group, along with a few others on this call. So should it be down to our discipline-specific bodies to improve this area, or should we be going outside?
I mean, that's a great idea, actually. I think I hadn't even thought of that, but you know, why not? Like, I mean, not in the sense of like, I think we should probably be reaching out. Our organizations should probably be reaching out to these bodies and saying, look, you know, we've realized there's an issue in the education in our, you know, in our fields and subfields around these areas. What can we do to collaborate and learn, and you know, and you guys to help us improve education in those areas. I think that's an awesome idea. So yeah, we'll be noted at the next BASIS meeting then, assuming I remember, or you know, you can bring it up, Chris.
I think we could probably do this all day, but we're reaching the end of the hour now, and I know that everyone is on tight schedules, so I guess we probably need to wrap it up fairly shortly. From my own point of view, James, I've really enjoyed this. I want to talk to you for the rest of the day on all this, but so pass you back to Vanessa there to kind of wrap up the session.
All right, so I think you've done a great job of wrapping up. This was really informative, and I will link out on our Twitter feed some of the links that we've been talking about. But thank you everybody for attending, and our next journal club is February 10th. Look on Twitter, there's a place to register, and we hope to see you back in this space in February. Thanks again, James, so much.
No, thanks again for having me. And I guess I'll just say, you know, if anyone wants to chat about this more, then feel free to drop me an email or whatever. Happy to arrange a call and just shoot the breeze about this sort of stuff.
Arrange it around about a time of a beer delivery. I feel like this is the kind of conversation that you want to kick back and have in a really relaxed way. You could go.
Yeah, we can have some beers or make some coffee, depending upon the time of day.
All right, thanks everyone.